A mother elephant in Kenya is walking across the savannah with two friends. All three have poison-tipped arrows buried in their sides, courtesy of poachers who, for reasons that remain entirely their own problem, decided shooting elephants was a viable career path. The elephants are in serious pain, bleeding, and have every reason in the world to avoid anything resembling a human being for the rest of their natural lives. Instead, they walk directly toward a wildlife rescue center, not away from it, toward it. One of the three elephants happened to have previously mated with two former orphans who had been raised and released by that exact facility. Meaning this elephant somehow associated that specific patch of savanna and the species responsible for shooting her with the concept of help rather than harm. This actually happened. It's documented, photographed, and written up by the very rescue organization involved. And it is frankly one of the stranger and more unsettling facts about the animal kingdom once you really sit with it. Wild animals, creatures with every biological and evolutionary reason to treat humans as the single most dangerous predator on the planet, which, as we've covered before, we statistically and measurably are sometimes walk straight toward us when they've in trouble, not toward another member of their own species, which would at least make some intuitive sense. Toward us specifically, the species most responsible for hunting them, displacing them, poisoning them, and generally making their lives considerably more difficult for the last several thousand years. So why does this happen? Why would a wild dolphin, a wild elephant, a wild fox, a wild raven, none of whom have any obvious evolutionary reason to trust us, sometimes decide that we are exactly the right creature to approach when everything has gone wrong? The answer involves some genuinely rigorous published science, a few theories about animal cognition that are still hotly debated in academic circles, and a handful of documented cases so specific and so strange that they sound more like folklore, passed around a campfire than actual field biology written up in peer-reviewed journals. Let's start with the most scientifically solid example in this entire story because it's Rokenhenses, measured, and published in one of the most prestigious science journals in the world. And it involves a bird that has, through pure evolutionary pragmatism, rather than anything resembling sentiment, learned to recruit humans as functional hunting partners. The Greater Honeyguide, found across sub-Saharan Africa, has a problem. It loves beeswax and bee larvae, but it physically cannot break into a beehive on its own. Bees are dangerous. Hives are heavily defended by thousands of stinging insects with no interest in sharing. And a small bird has no good way of getting past that defense by itself. Humans, on the other hand, have fire and tools, and have figured out over generations how to subdue bees and crack open a hive to extract honey safely. But humans are frankly pretty terrible at actually locating where the hidden hives are in the first place, often tucked away deep inside trees, scattered across enormous, difficult-to-search stretches of bush. So, the Honeyguide solves both problems at once, in a beautifully efficient division of labor. It finds the hive, using its own specialized senses and knowledge of the landscape. Then it flies toward a human honey hunter, calling loudly and persistently and unmistakably, and physically leads that person, often over a considerable distance through difficult terrain, directly to the hidden nest. The human opens the hive using fire and tools, takes the honey for their own use, and leaves behind the wax and the larvae, the part the bird actually wants and cannot otherwise reach, as payment for services rendered. For a long time, this relationship was treated as a charming but somewhat anecdotal piece of natural history. The kind of story that gets repeated in documentaries, without much rigorous testing behind it. Then in 2016, a team of researchers, led by Claire Spottiswoode, actually tested it experimentally in Mozambique, and the results published in the journal Science were genuinely remarkable. Local honey hunters use a very specific vocal call, passed down carefully through generations, of practice specifically meant to summon a honeyguide's cooperation. When researchers played that exact call, compared against other control sounds of similar volume and duration, the honeyguides responded dramatically and measurably differently. The specific cooperation call increased the probability of being guided to a nest by a honey guide from roughly 33% up to 66%, essentially doubling the bird's willingness to engage, and it increased the overall probability of successfully finding a bee's nest, from 17% all the way up to 54%. The bird wasn't simply reacting to noise in general, the way it might react to any sudden sound in its environment. It was recognizing one specific human signal among many, and attaching real, functional, actionable meaning to it. This particular sound means this particular human wants to cooperate with me right now, and is worth my time and effort to assist. This is, according to the researchers themselves, one of the only known examples on Earth of a genuinely wild, completely undomesticated animal engaging in active, learned, mutually beneficial cooperation with humans through real bidirectional communication, rather than simply tolerating our presence out of necessity or indifference. It's not a pet. It's not trained in captivity by a handler with treats. It's a free-living wild bird that has, through some combination of evolutionary pressure and individual learning, passed down across countless generations of honeyguides, figured out that humans are useful collaborators, specifically worth recruiting for a shared task, and has developed an actual functioning communication channel to do exactly that, completely independent of any human attempt to domesticate or train it. This raises an important and somewhat uncomfortable question for the rest of this video. When an animal asks a human for help, what is actually happening cognitively inside that animal's brain? Is it genuinely understanding in some meaningful sense that humans possess the specific capability to solve its specific problem? Or is something considerably simpler going on underneath the surface? Something that merely looks like understanding from the outside. Researchers studying this distinguish between a few different possible explanations, and they don't all require the same level of sophisticated thought from the animal involved. The most basic explanation is pure learned association. An animal has at some point in its life personally experienced humans doing something helpful, and it generalizes that one experience to future situations of distress. This doesn't require the animal to understand anything about human intentions, capabilities, or separate minds at all. It just requires a simple reinforced behavioral link. Humans in this specific context, plus distress, equals relief, based purely on something it has personally witnessed or experienced before, with no deeper reasoning required behind it. A more sophisticated explanation requires something closer to a basic theory of mind. Some limited partial understanding that humans have their own separate goals, abilities, and intentions, genuinely distinct from the animal's own internal experience. This is a much higher cognitive bar to clear, and it's genuinely and actively debated among researchers exactly how many non-human species actually clear it, and to what degree they clear it. But there's compelling behavioral evidence, what particularly from domesticated species, studied under controlled laboratory conditions, that at least some animals are operating with something in this more sophisticated category of understanding. The clearest example comes from dogs, and it's been studied with genuine scientific rigor, using mobile eye tracking technology attached directly to the animals during real-world interactions. Researchers have found that dogs respond dramatically more strongly to a combination of human, pointing and direct eye gaze together than they do to either signal alone, in isolation, or to other directional cues that aren't specifically aimed at communicating something deliberate, like a fake throwing motion. When a human points at an object while also looking directly at the dog in what researchers that technically call an ostensive manner, clearly deliberately signaling, I am trying to tell you something specific right now. Dogs track that referenced object with significantly more sustained attention and approach it correctly far more often than random chance alone would ever predict. This is referential communication in its purest, most measurable form. The dog isn't just reacting to motion or sound in a generic sense. It's actively interpreting the human's gesture as meaningfully pointing towards something specific and external. The same basic cognitive skill that human infants develop quite early in life when they first start understanding that a pointing finger means look over there at that thing rather than simply look at my finger itself. That same basic cognitive skill, just running in reverse, may be exactly what happening when a distressed wild animal approaches a human during a genuine crisis. If an animal has developed even a rudimentary sense that humans are independent agents, capable of understanding a problem and then acting purposefully on it. Then making a deliberate approach toward a person, rather than simply fleeing, hiding, or passively waiting to die in isolation, becomes a genuinely intelligent, calculated strategy, rather than some kind of random behavioral accident, or fluke. So, let's actually look at some of the documented individual cases, because the sheer breadth and remarkable specificity of these stories is genuinely what makes this entire topic so compelling to dig into. There's the case of a bottlenose dolphin, off the coast of Hawaii, that approached a group of scuba shavers swimming in an unmistakably awkward, labored, clearly impaired manner that immediately set it apart from normal dolphin movement. The diving instructor, Keller Laros, initially followed the standard sensible wildlife guidance of not interfering with marine animals in their natural environment. A rule that exists for very good reasons most of the time. But the dolphin's behavior was distinct enough, and persistent enough, repeatedly circling back rather than swimming away, that it became unmistakably clear something specific was genuinely wrong. It turned out the dolphin had swallowed a fishhook with fishing line wound tightly around its work, severely restricting its ability to swim and breathe properly. Laros worked carefully and patiently to remove the hook and cut away the tangled line. When he finished, the dolphin didn't simply swim off immediately the way you might expect a wild animal to bolt the second it was freed. According to the account, it surfaced for a breath and then deliberately came back, facing the diver directly in what was widely interpreted by witnesses as some kind of acknowledgement, or gesture of thanks, before finally departing for good. There's the case of a raven that perched conspicuously on a fence outside a rural property and squawked persistently and loudly for over an hour straight, refusing to leave despite no one initially responding to the noise. When someone eventually went outside to investigate what all the commotion was about, they found the bird had 4 porcupine quills embedded painfully in its face and wing, clearly causing significant pain and visible distress. The bird allowed a human, a complete stranger by any reasonable measure of trust between two entirely different species, to come close enough to physically remove all 4 quills, one at a time. An act that required the raven to tolerate exactly the kind of close sustained human contact that every survival instinct it possesses should theoretically have been screaming at it to avoid at absolutely all costs. There's the case of an Indian elephant whose calf had fallen into a deep man-made watering hole, and simply could not climb back out on its own, no matter how hard it tried. The mother elephant, in obvious and escalating distress, approached a nearby road and made what observers described as clear, repeated, genuinely unmistakable overtures toward passing humans, refusing to simply give up and wander away, despite some initial confusion among the people about what exactly she was trying to communicate. She eventually succeeded in leading a group of people back to the watering hole, where they quickly organized a proper rescue effort and pulled the trapped calf safely back up to solid ground. There's the case of a southern right whale off the coast of Sydney, entangled in a heavy twisted mass of fishing line and assorted plastic garbage caught tightly around its mouth, approached a small boat and repeatedly surfaced and bobbed directly alongside it until one of the teenagers aboard was finally able to reach out and physically pull the tangled debris free from its face. There's a similarly remarkable documented case of a whale shark off the coast of Australia that swam directly up to a fishing boat and then floated calmly and patiently, completely still for a full 20 minutes, while a diver carefully removed a tightly wound rope from around its enormous body, an animal roughly the size of a school bus, deliberately holding itself motionless for a human stranger to perform what was functionally a genuine act of veterinary care with absolutely no anesthesia, no restraints, and no guarantee whatsoever of the animal's continued cooperation throughout the entire process. And then there's the case that might be the strangest and most specific of all the documented examples. A wild fox in Russia, filmed with its head completely and hopelessly stuck inside a glass jar, wandering directly up to a group of men standing nearby, and simply standing there in front of them, clearly trapped and clearly distressed, until one of the men removed the jar entirely by hand. The fox trotted off cheerfully into the forest immediately afterward, apparently pausing briefly to glance back at the men in what the person filming the whole encounter jokingly described online as a brief acknowledgement before the animal disappeared back into the trees. For good, presumably never to be seen by those particular humans again. What's especially interesting and genuinely worth pausing on for a moment is that the people who spend their entire professional careers working directly with injured and rescued, the wildlife report, this exact pattern happening across an enormous, almost surprising range of species. Not just the famously intelligent ones like elephants and dolphins that you'd naturally expect to show this kind of sophisticated behavior. Researchers and rehabilitators working at long-term wildlife sanctuaries have documented animals like coyotes, wolves, bears, and cougars, all displaying the same essential pattern when in genuine extremis. An animal that would normally maintain significant instinctive distance from humans, sometimes one that has had relatively limited prior direct contact with people throughout its entire life, will nonetheless approach and essentially solicit help during a moment of real acute crisis, in a way that looks distinctly and noticeably different from its completely normal, wary day-to-day behavior around humans under ordinary circumstances. One particularly striking documented case involved 4 young wild deer, completely exhausted after attempting to swim across the dangerously icy waters of Stevens Penrose Passage off the coast of Alaska, clearly struggling and at real risk of drowning from sheer exhaustion and hypothermia. Spotting a boat in the distance, all 4 animals swam directly and deliberately toward it and were eventually pulled aboard by the people on it. Behavior that runs directly counter to literally every instinct a wild deer would normally have around an unfamiliar vessel, full of unfamiliar primates reaching out toward it. When the alternative is drowning alone in freezing water, apparently the underlying calculation shifts dramatically and immediately. And whatever innate fear response usually keeps deer at a safe, healthy distance from humans, gets completely overridden by something considerably stronger and more urgent in that specific moment. This pattern, genuinely desperate circumstances, overriding otherwise completely normal avoidance behavior, appears again and again across nearly every single documented case researchers have collected. It strongly suggests that the baseline weariness wild animals show toward humans, the very same deeply ingrained fear response we covered in detail when discussing why animals learned to fear us as an entire species, isn't some kind of fixed, unbreakable, absolute rule, etched permanently into their behavior. It's more accurately described as a default setting carefully calibrated under ordinary circumstances by countless millennia of evolutionary pressure, combined with individually learned caution. But default settings can apparently, under the right extreme conditions, be overridden entirely when an animal's specific situation becomes desperate enough that the calculated risk of approaching a human becomes genuinely smaller than the near certain immediate risk of doing absolutely nothing at all. There's also a deeper evolutionary angle worth seriously considering here, one that goes well beyond any individual animal's personal in-the-moment reasoning during a single crisis. Some species may carry a longer, more generationally inherited history with humans, specifically because their distant ancestors' occasional willingness to approach us under the right specific circumstances produce genuinely beneficial outcomes, often enough across many generations to be reinforced and maintained over evolutionary time, even within populations that remain technically wild and entirely undomesticated in every other respect. The Honeyguide is by far the clearest example of this exact dynamic running on a true, evolutionary timescale rather than merely an individual one. An entire wild species has developed a specific dedicated communication signal, explicitly, because cooperating with humans generation after generation after generation paid off reliably enough to be genuinely worth maintaining as a stable inherited behavioral strategy, passed down through the species. It's not that every single individual Honeyguide consciously reasons through the deliberate decision to recruit a human helper each time. It's that the underlying behavior itself proved evolutionarily useful enough repeatedly, across enough individual birds and enough successive generations, to become a stable, predictable, genuinely fixed feature of the entire species' behavioral repertoire. Something structurally quite similar may be happening in a far less formalized and far less species-wide way with intelligent species like elephants, which possess remarkably long individual memories, sophisticated social learning capabilities, and a well-documented capacity to pass detailed behavioral knowledge down through extended family groups across multiple generations of matriarchal leadership. An elephant population that has had genuinely positive helpful experiences with a specific conservation organization, even indirectly through the experiences of related individuals, somewhere within the broader herd structure, may carry forward a kind of inherited socially transmitted association across the group. This particular type of human operating in this particular place has historically and reliably meant relief from suffering rather than danger or harm. That's a meaningfully different thing from some kind of broad universal trust extended toward humans as an entire species. It's a highly specific, narrowly conditional, carefully learned exception carved out deliberately from an otherwise entirely justified, fully, and rationally warranted general weariness toward humans as a whole. It's worth being genuinely honest in closing this out, about the real limits of what we can actually claim here, with full scientific confidence and intellectual rigor. We cannot directly interview a dolphin, an elephant, or a raven about its precise internal mental state, in the exact moment it chooses to approach a human seeking help. Researchers studying this phenomenon are understandably and appropriately cautious about over-interpreting observed behavior, fully aware of just how easy it is for humans to project rich, complex emotional narratives onto animal behavior that might, in cold scientific reality, be explained by something considerably simpler than genuine cognitive understanding of human minds and intentions. An animal in extreme distress, exhausted, injured, and genuinely out of better options, might simply be drawn toward relative stillness, toward large, unfamiliar structures like boats and vehicles that represent novelty rather than immediate threat, toward the simple absence of any further immediate danger signal in its environment, all without necessarily possessing any deeper cognitive grasp of the specific idea that this particular human has the unique capability to solve my specific problem. But the Honeyguide case is genuinely different from the rest of these anecdotes because it isn't merely an anecdote at all. It's a rigorously controlled, carefully repeatable, formally published scientific experiment demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt that a genuinely wild, completely undomesticated animal can learn to recognize one specific human signal among many competing sounds and respond to it with real, measurable, functionally accurate understanding of exactly what that particular signal means for mutual cooperative benefit. And once you know with certainty that at least one wild species is unambiguously, scientifically capable of that level of sophisticated interspecies communication and signal interpretation, the broader pattern of wild animals occasionally seeking out humans during moments of genuine crisis becomes considerably less far-fetched and considerably more scientifically plausible as something rooted in real, if necessarily limited cognitive understanding, rather than pure coincidence or simple wishful human interpretation projected after the fact. Maybe it's a precise narrow evolutionary mutualism, carefully refined over countless generations of selective pressure, exactly like the relationship between the honey guide and the honey hunter. Maybe it's an individual animal's hard-won deeply personal association between one specific place, one specific group of people, and the specific remembered relief from past pain or danger. Maybe in the most desperate and acute cases of all, it's simply an overridden survival instinct in the moment, a calculated risk taken purely because every other available option has already run out, completely, and there's genuinely nothing left to lose by trying. Whatever the precise underlying mechanism turns out to be in each individual documented case, the broader pattern itself is remarkably consistent and remarkably well documented across the scientific and anecdotal record alike, spanning species that share almost nothing else meaningfully in common with one another. Birds, mammals, marine animals, separated by tens of millions of years of independent evolutionary divergence, occasionally, and independently arriving at the exact same desperate calculated decision when circumstances turn dire enough, when everything else fails, when the pain becomes genuinely too much to bear alone, and every instinct screams to run, hide, or simply endure it in isolation. some wild animals, make a choice that quietly defies the very fear response we spent so much of our shared evolutionary history actively teaching them to feel toward us. They walk deliberately, and against every ingrained instinct, toward the single most dangerous predator on the entire planet. Because sometimes, against every evolutionary lesson telling them otherwise, that exact predator turns out to be precisely what they need.